This is the League of Women Voters Summit Wasatch unit, and we're happy to have Josh Kraft with us today. And Josh, will you introduce yourself and something about your organization, and then give us a good presentation? Thanks.
Yeah, why don't I share my slides and then I can introduce myself as just click over there.
Okay.
Can people see me and hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm going to be talking today about the bipartisan infrastructure law and what it means for sort of energy environment, but particularly the energy and transportation side of things, and hopefully leave some time for questions. Please, just to, if I'm going too fast, or if you need additional information on something, please just yell at me, tell me to stop. That way we can get through it and be able to be productive presentation. So I will let everyone know, in case you haven't seen anything about Utah Clean Energy. We are a nonprofit organization working here in Utah. We're based in Salt Lake City, and we've been working for over 20 years now on climate solutions and clean energy. And we do work on a number of fronts. We work at the legislature and increasingly with our congressional delegation on policy matters. We work a lot before the Utah Public Service Commission on the plans, particularly for Rocky Mountain Power, around electricity, and specifically around renewable energy, electric vehicles, and then increasingly, and also, of course, energy efficiency. We also do a lot of work on try to make Utah a leader on climate solutions, working with both parties. And it's been awesome, certainly, to work with folks from, when we can, from League of Women Voters and the different chapters here in Utah. You all do wonderful, wonderful work. This is just a little bit more about where we focus our work at, at Utah Clean Energy. And so we work in the built environment on energy efficiency and trying to get our buildings to be as close to net zero as possible. We work primarily on electrified transportation, both for passenger vehicles and also increasingly medium and heavy duty vehicles. We do a lot of work on renewable energy and electric energy storage. And then that's picture on the right-hand corner was an event we did, a climate talk we organized at Science Bank that Senator Mitt Romney attended. And we've been instrumental in launching an initiative we call the Climate and Clean Air Compact, which is at this point over 175 signatories from business, government, faith, health institutions, trying to make Utah a national leader, particularly among more conservative leaning states, on climate solutions. So as I talk a little bit more about the various new federal laws, but the infrastructure bill, I think I wanted to put this in context for why this is important. The major reason, of course, is that we know that we need to reduce our emissions from our major economic sectors as quickly as possible to zero. That is not a little bit, not some, but zero. And that's a tremendous challenge when you're looking at our infrastructure for energy, for transportation, for shipping, just it's everything, the way we get around, our energy systems, our food systems. And I'd like to share this graph from Dr. Saul Griffith. He is a MacArthur Award-winning Genius Grant Award winner physicist who kind of mapped the entire energy system from beginning uses, refining, processing to end use. And he ends up being really optimistic about the possibilities for transforming all our energy and transportation systems. But he also calculates that we have to turn over about 1 billion machines. So when looking at this, there's a lot of changes that we have to make in our homes and our businesses, but also at big industry, big factories. And I think it's important to think through that as we're looking through big investments like we've seen in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but also the opportunities that we have as a society to create economic opportunity as we drive down emissions, and then the role we play as citizens. Because some of these things, as you'll see within the bipartisan infrastructure law, are grants, and they require implementation and follow-up through large, important, but not always fast-moving bureaucracies at the national level, the state level, and the local level. And that's where I think you all have such an important role to play, and not one that I can determine, but one that's want to look forward to. So a lot of emissions to reduce. Keep it there. Quickly, when we're thinking about what we call the bipartisan infrastructure law now, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it was a bill that was passed in November of 2021, and for a variety of reasons, it received a lot more open Republican and conservative support than what some of the other plans that eventually went through, namely the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a different bill that passed last August. The bottom line was that this was a combination of a surface transportation reauthorization bill, all our big transportation infrastructure. The total tab was about $1.2 trillion, but about $500 billion of that was in effect new spending, new investment, and on a variety of measures, mostly about physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, airports. But there was also an important element of clean energy and energy efficiency and electric vehicles. That was kind of the new stuff. I'll break that down in a minute, but I think it's worth, can anyone kind of make sense of, to make sense of this slide? This is a slide that the Rocky Mountain Institute put together. And I like to highlight it just to show the scale of change that we've seen historically over the last 3 or 4 decades in national investments, government investment in effect, climate and clean energy activity. And it's just a much larger, much more robust, and much more sustained level investment that we've seen in a very long time. It's effectively about $80 billion a year for at least 5 years and maybe a bit longer. If you're looking at the 3 bills that Congress passed in the first 2 terms of President Biden's, it's which includes the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and then what we're going to be spending our time on today with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And if you look at the previous 10-year period from 2009 to 2017, that was at the time a very significant level of investment in clean energy and energy efficiency, and it was pretty impactful. We saw tremendous cost drops in, for instance, in solar PV, energy LED lighting, and then eventually batteries for cars, and the market for those has just fundamentally changed. And so we're talking about large. I know we don't always love to talk about spending money, but my view is that it moves markets, it makes change, and we're solving a money problem, which is a first important barrier to addressing climate solutions. When looking at the two things, when looking at this is kind of my bubbles for breaking down that $80 billion within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's a fairly large investment in energy efficiency programs, some major investments in electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and I'll provide some more detail there. There's certainly some additional grant programs for other zero emissions vehicles. There's a lot for updating the electricity grid, not necessarily for purposes of making it cleaner, but to make it more resilient, harden it, so the big interstate transmission lines in particular. And then there's a fair amount of investment in new energy technologies that are not new, but emerging energy technologies. The one I'm going to talk about today is hydrogen, because I think that has the most relevance to Utah and some of the debates that we're having. And I think the last element, just as overview, there was a lot of focus on oil, gas, and coal communities that may be in transition. And I think that was in part because of Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, obviously a coal community. But I think that's something where Utah and our neighboring states can benefit given our legacy here and, and also our expertise in those areas. So something, all those are kind of broadly speaking, the buckets. And I'll note that unlike the Inflation Reduction Act that passed later, most of this money comes in the forms of grants. That is money that will go to a mixture of state agencies and local governments, tribal governments, sometimes school K through 12 schools. And so it isn't, and for better and for worse, this requires an entity on both ends to make a proposal, to figure out what they're going to do with the funds, apply for those funds, and then, distribute the money. And so we can expect that the impact of this will be a little bit slower, but not necessarily in the long term any less significant. But we're talking about a lot of this in this area outside, particularly outside of the EV infrastructure and the energy efficiency infrastructure, is kind of longer term, big demonstration projects for emerging technologies that we may not see the impact on overnight. The next few slides are not necessarily the most artful. I threw them together in the last week, but this is just a quick snapshot. The General Services Administration looked at the total funding that has currently been announced for Utah, and it's about $1.9 billion. The majority of which is for transportation. I don't exactly have a breakdown of where this will go. I don't know if what I'm going to talk about within the electric vehicle sector goes into the transportation bucket or the climate and energy bucket here. Sorry for that, but so it's a fair bit of money that's already been announced.
Josh, but Utah didn't get anything in 2022, right? From the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we will get something this year in 2023. Is that what you're saying?
No, some grants came in last year.
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can talk a little bit more about the EV stuff. As far as my understanding is that the electric vehicle infrastructure hasn't yet been, it's been authorized, but it's not been allocated. That is to say, the check is not yet, it's on its way, but it's not necessarily here.
To Utah.
To Utah.
Okay.
To a lot of states.
Any state. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, to Jill, to your question, most folks have probably, since you all are engaged, have probably read something about the relationship between the bipartisan infrastructure law and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. That's, and the total funds were within the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think the total was about $15 billion for electric vehicles total, and half of that, $7.5 billion nationally, was for a grant program to basically do highway charging infrastructure at intervals to make sure that major highways in every state had fast charging along major highway corridors. And that's the map on the right hand side, is that Utah will roughly have, they're going to comply with the plan. There's roughly a charger every 50 miles or so. I think that they got an exemption out in the west on I-80. You can see there's one in Dell, and then I think there's probably some in Wendover and on the other side in Nevada. But otherwise, we're along major highways. That's where we're planning to either upgrade or install all this new highway charging infrastructure. Utah's share, I've listed it here, is about $37.5 million over 5 years, so roughly $7 million a year. And there's been some final, my understanding is that our plan has been approved. It had certain requirements. You got it if you wanted it. And so as far as I know, no states rejected this pot of money. And there were standards that had to be met in the first round. There's some additional requirements there's some Buy American and some apprenticeship requirements that relate to the actual disbursement of the first round of funds. And my understanding is that they're updating and finalizing the plan. That is, they being the Utah Department of Transportation. They're expected to put out later this summer or late spring, early summer, an RFP for private providers who can actually do the installation and maintain the physical charging infrastructure along highway corridors. Some of them in these stations, as you can see, you may not be able to see, and I'll share these slides, but there's a color coding of the map of where they're updating an existing charger, where they're going to build a new charger, and then where there's already some that are completed, and so that along these corridors. So they may or may not be picking, but the locations are more or less set. The other important piece of context is that Rocky Mountain Power, which serves the 80% of customers in the state, and outside of some municipal utilities, and I know that Heber and Midway, you are served by a municipal utility over there. But for the majority of the area of the state, Rocky Mountain along highways, Rocky Mountain Power is the major utility. They have funds from ratepayers for an electric vehicle infrastructure program, the so-called EVIP, and where they have about $50 million over 5 years that they can use from their electricity customers to pay for EV infrastructure. And so my expectation is that the state will pair some of the national funds for corridor charging with Rocky Mountain Power's funds, and then they will also look to supplement. Rocky Mountain Power, I'm sure, will look to supplement in different areas outside of highway charging corridors where they can do infill, perhaps fleets. We'll have to kind of see, but that's sort of the basic gist. We're waiting for a little more information. The link that I'm including here UDOT has a pretty good set of information about where they're at. And again, I expect that they haven't announced it yet, but at the end of, I suspect in the next 2 months, we'll probably have information about when they're going to issue that RFP and actually starting to do the work.
And Josh, with all of this money for charging stations, do you think that will in Utah be all complete by 2030?
I mean, I expect it'll be complete much quicker than that. I would assume that by 2025, the majority of this work will be done. I mean, it's not particularly challenging infrastructure. There may be some grid upgrades as where the demand rises that need to be done on Rocky Mountain Power's end, but these are not very hard projects to site. As far as I've not heard of a big material constraint, with regard to the charging stations. If that makes sense.
Good.
There's a complementary program here that's worth talking about for just a minute. In addition to the highway charging for states that UDOT will be taking, there's a charging and fueling implementation discretionary grant program. It's a super exciting name for everybody, I understand, but it's the same program in effect, but it's a competitive grant program, meaning you can apply if you wish, and there's about $2.5 billion for non-state government entities, cities, counties, tribal governments, schools, and transportation agencies may also be able to apply. I'd probably expect it so that, High Valley Transit could apply, some can, for additional supplemental fast charging, to sort of fill in outside of major highway corridors, or there may be an area that's, some of the eastern Utah roads that are, not major highway corridors, like sort of rural, that may need some additional charging. The first round of applications are due for this in the end of May. And I think it's about $700 million that is being applied for. We've checked around. I don't know. I think that Salt Lake City is applying, and I believe that for this round of funding. I think also that if they can, that folks involved in the inland port are likely also to apply. My understanding was that from conversations is that Summit County was not going to apply. And I want to say that, it's good to keep tabs on these things. I expect one quirk of the early days of EV charging is, for reasons that they're not easy to explain in a very short period of time, but when utilization rates of chargers are low, you end up paying a disproportionate amount of money in demand charges to the utility, so that basically they're not very cost effective in the early days. And so that's been I think that will get worked out both from the rate perspective with Rocky Mountain Power, and also the number of customers using charging infrastructure will increase. So this is a temporary blip. It's not a major issue in the long term. But I think that will play into the decisions about whether someone like a Summit County or a Park City may contract with Rocky Mountain Power or a third party to help handle these issues. It's not necessarily a sign that they're not interested, but it is something we're going to keep tabs on as to who applies. And I would expect that the majority of folks who apply who put together a good proposal here will get the funds. I don't think that they're going to be, but will have, it's $2.5 billion over a national scope. My personal hope is that some of our Eastern Utah electric co-ops, rural electric co-ops, get some of those funds, and then the area that on the west side of Salt Lake County get some of those funds, because I understand that that's kind of been a challenge for folks trying to cross the county and into Tooele, to get across. So but we'll have to see who applies. I don't know all the entities yet.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I happen to have a Tesla, and when I bought it, I have unlimited charging. Fast charging.
Yep.
We don't have a charging station in Park City, but we do have free charging in Park City.
Yep.
What have they done that all these other cities haven't done? And maybe that's why they haven't. Summit County, they must have allocated some money somewhere. I just want to know what I'm missing and why other towns aren't doing this. And and having this Tesla really limits you to your scope from Park City to St. George. There's only 2 charging stations, one in Nephi and one in Beaver. Beaver put in so many charging stations, they blew out the grid for the entire city, so that they had to limit their anyway, what I'm trying to get to, it's just not it's a very complicated issue, because if you have an electric car and it is cold, you get less charge than ever. It almost cuts it by a third.
Yep.
And anyway, I guess all these things, but
no, it's a very real issue. My expectation is that some of the issues and some around getting to St. George and Las Vegas from Northern Utah will be addressed by the previous program, that will get much more. And there's also requirements for Tesla chargers to participate in the program, they need to let others make use of those charging, and then vice versa. So there's going to be more universal charging availability to folks who don't drive Teslas. There is no doubt. I hadn't heard about the St. George issue, the Beaver issue before. I think that Beaver still has an electric grid, fortunately, but it is an issue that we're going to have demand on, high demand, and that will be a strain.
We often have to stand in line in Nephi.
Yep.
Yeah. And if you're
I think that some of those issues will, I mean, we'll have to see. That's one of the advantages, frankly, of having the utilities are involved, is that they will be incented and have an incentive to maintain robust charging infrastructure. But I mean, we'll certainly have to, work that out. And range anxiety in the winter months will be a thing, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, and I understand that I was told that the one in Beaver was somewhat supplemented by the restaurants there. So there's an incentive, because you need to charge your car for so long, that property owners around might subsidize charging stations.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been around the state. I mean, and I think that is to say that a lot of major retailers, 7-Eleven, IKEA, are getting in the business of trying to do EV charging. I suspect that will grow in the next few years. There'll certainly be some headaches, for sure. But I thank you, and I'll keep an eye on the Beaver thing. I want to figure that out.
Yeah.
I had not heard that.
Yeah.
This is, and I want to, the other, a couple more slides here. The other thing to keep an eye on the electric vehicle front is that the EPA has a clean school bus program, and I won't torture everyone. I'll send these slides around. You don't need to read all this text, but there's a $2.5 billion program to replace older diesel buses, 2010 or older, with cleaner vehicles. They don't have to be electric. They can be natural gas or propane vehicles in some situations, but EPA and the Biden administration are clearly prioritizing electric school buses. And there's a lot of advantages to buying an electric school bus from an emissions perspective, from a maintenance perspective, but it is a higher upfront cost. My understanding is right now it's about 3 times the upfront cost of an existing diesel bus, and so there's a cost premium for sure. And the other issues to the I'm sorry, the previous speaker, I didn't see your name because of my sharing my screen, but I will say that there will be some challenges, I think, for a while to be honest, with an electric school bus. They're obviously not like Park City has electric buses. They work fairly well. I know that I've heard some folks suggest that there are challenges. It's a new asset. It's much easier if you're on the maintenance staff to, if you're used, you have a diesel school bus, you just put in your diesel, and that's what you do to refuel it. There's clearly a much more of a management issue with having batteries that, and packs and charging equipment that you need to manage. For the most part, it seems like the buses themselves have performed fairly well, and I suspect that they'll get better. There's a global market for electric buses, particularly in China. So I think that we'll get this right. But I will say it's something that will surely need some support for school districts as they install this new equipment, they manage it, they figure out how to use it. There's a lot of advantages. I suspect the technology will win out, but it's new. And I just note that there was the first round of these funds. I was surprised and pleasantly so that two rural Utah school districts won a grant, Tintic, which is near Eureka, and Uinta and Vernal, and they both went for electric school buses, which was a little surprising. I suspected they might choose another technology. lot of rural school areas, if you're not in this area, and this is fairly obvious, but they use their school buses to travel longer distances for tours, for activities. And so it's there, school buses aren't just for getting around like those of us from Salt Lake, in the city. But so those will be early test cases, and then we'll be watching them closely. As far as I know, they got the award last August. I don't know the status of when the buses will actually be delivered, but we'll be watching. And the next round of funding just opened yesterday. It's about $400 million for grants for electric buses, or any buses that's available until the beginning of next school year, more or less August of 2023. Rural and poor, rural tribal communities tend to be prioritized in this grant. And so I suspect we'll see another round of folks who are outside of an urban community win this round. I don't know if what will happen with if other school districts plan to apply at this point. Is there a question?
Yeah, Josh, so there's a question in the chat.
Cool.
Amy, do you want to say it, or shall I read it?
Was wondering if any thought had been given to EV chargers on US 40 between Heber and the Colorado border. There would be 2 or 3 counties involved there that would need to get together to make sure there's some continuity along the way, but just wondered if that had come up in conversation.
Amy, I don't know yet, but I'll check. That was what that would be a good candidate for the discretionary grant program. Obviously, to fill the gap, the gap there. And some of that area is served by, if not a lot of it is served by one of the rural co-ops. So they have less, resources compared with Rocky Mountain Power to invest. Sorry, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Josh, have you finished the slides?
Let me just touch base 2 more and then we'll be
Okay,
finished.
no, that's fine. Just wondered.
I'll run through the last ones. They're a little, I wanted to say that we also care about energy efficiency here at Utah Clean Energy. And one of the big investments that has been offered is about $500 million for energy efficiency upgrades at K through 12 schools. There was a $80 million round of funding that I know that Salt Lake City School District was planning to apply for to help do energy efficiency, renewable energy upgrades at schools. There's also ventilation. And so there'll be other opportunities for folks in other communities to apply. I don't actually know who won yet. And I certainly hope that things get spread around a bit, but Salt Lake City School District has done some, and their students have done some good work here. So it'd be nice for them to get a matching grant. There's some additional money also from the Department of Energy for what they're calling an energy class prize to help train energy managers at schools. And if this is a long way of saying, if there's anyone who participates in school board meetings or who has children or grandchildren in schools, there's some help. And you have teachers, administrators wondering if there's money to help with energy or ventilation upgrades. There should be. And so that funding's out there. And I hope that they're getting that distributed. That run of funding just closed in April. So I think that it's going to be a bit before we know when it's awarded, but we'll see. That money's coming. The last piece that I wanted to, on the infrastructure fund that I think is important to note, pretty out there, but this is big. Infrastructure there's a lot of hype around hydrogen development. Hydrogen it's ever present in the world, big element, but it provides some opportunities to provide some services from existing fossil fuels if you make it in a clean way, meaning that you develop it probably through a process through electrolysis, split water, with using renewable energy, and to primarily at first run probably being used for longer duration energy storage, electricity storage as a resource. It's one of the more cost-effective ways to store that we know of today to store electricity from renewables for longer periods of time. Potentially, there are some other applications in shipping, long-duty trucking, creating ammonia, fertilizer that could be developed. Really, for the moment, we're primarily looking at hydrogen for energy storage purposes. And Utah has two big buckets of funding that they were looking for. There's about $7 billion total that Department of Energy is looking for to create a regional hydrogen hub, basically big demonstration projects that could demonstrate the potential of cleaner hydrogen for a variety of applications. And Utah, particularly out in the near Delta, western central Utah, happens to have these salt domes, caverns that are, my understanding, is fairly good for storing hydrogen or potentially storing fuels like hydrogen. And so there's been a plan to convert that at the Intermountain Power Project. That project that California will, Los Angeles area will purchase the majority of the output from. That's the sort of first run. There's also what they're calling Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub with Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico that the states are applying for about $1.25 billion to develop that grant. And I want to say that there's ways in which clean hydrogen could be great. There are ways in which clean hydrogen, hydrogen could be less great, particularly if you're creating it from natural gas. It can be very emissions intensive and not productive from a climate perspective. So there's some opportunity here if you're creating hydrogen from renewable energy, electricity. That's a costly process today, but one where there's an opportunity to reduce costs that could be good. But there's some other ways in which this could not be good for the climate. And so it's something I'm watching closely, and I encourage everyone here to watch closely as the state participates to see if they can develop this resource. So we're sort of in the middle on this one, but it's something that's big infrastructure. We're keeping an eye out on, and a lot of money in the Infrastructure Act for that. And then
Let's get a few more
Dan.
questions.
Yeah.
Martha, can you say your question? And I have a feeling that Chris Cherniak is going to have a question too.
Martha, could you unmute yourself?
Oh, I thought I had.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing this. My impression from what you've gone over is that these programs are coordinated across states, right? There's going to be every major highway get the EV charging stations, and that's a good thing. But my question is the connection and coordination with nonprofits like yours. Is there that connection to amplify the impact? And the reason for my question is I think these programs are terrific, but to keep them active, to keep them in front of the constituents and the consumer, I'm a believer that nonprofits are critical for that, because you keep everyone honest about these sorts of things. So I'm wondering if there is an effort to coordinate with nonprofits like yourself to help with how to spend the money, how to make the money go farther, etc. I think you get my point.
Martha, I'm not going to give you a very good answer to your question, but I'm going to try to give an answer to the question I want to answer, which is that capacity and knowledge about how to run programs is definitely at a premium. It's not that it's not there. It's that if you look at, I do think that the Biden administration and folks within the EPA's Region 8, which is the region that we're in, it's based in Denver. And then some folks at the Department of Energy are doing a good job of reaching out to nonprofits and kind of keeping that network up. And I think that there's sort of a network of funders for some of our work who are sort of turning the gears to make sure that we and some other partners can do that. There's definitely some good longer term partnerships. Utah Clean Cities is one that's worked on clean transportation for a while that is explicitly defunded by the Department of Energy. They are engaged. And I think that my impression in general with the folks at the state, UDOT has their act together. They're big. They want to get projects done and built. They're not always as collaborative as some folks are. They're not collaborative. It's just they run projects, what they do. The Office of Energy Development, which is our state energy office, they're entirely new. And so what I've heard generally from them is, and also our wonderful local governments is like, we're going to do some things, we need your help. And so we're trying to pick some places where we can offer capacity, but I think that they're very receptive to that, and local governments even more so. And they're doing a really good job. But it's a lot, and I think that we haven't had this level of investment in this sector for a very long time. And so I think we will never. And so it's I think everyone's kind of having to, build muscle here, for lack of a better term, to kind of make this go. And I think that I know this is kind of a flimsy request, but certainly if anyone, I'm sure that many of you have program administration management skills. And if you from folks in your local government, your school board, yeah, we'd like to do this, but we can't do this application. If you want to raise your hand or send it to us so we can find someone, it's quite welcome, because I think we'll need that and people will figure it out. But it is I wish that DOE had a stronger local presence. It's not that they're neglectful. It's just that there's not, as far as I can tell, like kind of same regional offices that the Environmental Protection Agency has. So it's you're sort of surfing, you're sort of searching to find the right person more than if there was someone here.
I'm sorry, Josh. Chris Cherniak, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, real quick. Hold on, I got it. Okay. The trucking industry, where is that leaning towards? It's going to be diesel for a long time, but is it leaning towards electric? Is it leaning towards hydrogen? Is it leaning towards some other type of form of energy?
For long haul trucking, I don't think we know yet. I don't think that. It seems like there's a series of products that within electricity and with hydrogen fuel cells that are competitive, and they're still determining. Obviously, in the shorter duration outside of that, for large vehicles, obviously we're seeing Amazon go all in with electric with the Rivian trucks. We're seeing school busing, as I think electric will probably predominate there. And I think we're seeing, but I don't have a sense of long haul trucking, what's going to win out. It's going to be hard and expensive to create a hydrogen infrastructure, but that fueling, if you can create the hubs, is nice because it's dense, right? So.
Okay, we've got 2 more minutes for another question. Zita, unmute.
Yeah. Okay. If anybody who has an electric vehicle could speak to anybody who doesn't, your maintenance on a electric vehicle sells itself. That's my only point. And it would be, I know trucking businesses have a lot of maintenance problems. So there's a way of, maybe economically, it pays for itself. Okay.
Amy has a Tesla, I know. Do you have good, easy maintenance on your Tesla, Amy?
Yes, in general. And what's nice is they'll come to your house to fix things, or they can, send you an upgrade, or, it's just a different world.
Okay.
Let me just say really quickly that certainly supporting young people and getting into the maintenance for a lot of things, being electricians is something we're all going to need, and also mechanics. And if you ever, I know that some of the local tech schools are looking for EVs that they can work on. So it's exciting, but it's also just a different thing, and it's still like a premium product, unlike an old Ford or GM car that you have lying around to work on. It's a different setup, but they're excited. So I've heard good things. We were folks at Weber State have been doing good work there and reaching out to the local high schools to create a workforce for EVs.
Well, that's cool. This has been a fabulous discussion. Chris Cherniak, we've got 5 minutes left. Can you give us some update in your areas of expertise?
My areas, yes, this area, 2 areas to give you an update. First, the drought, and then we'll turn to snow melt. So 2 minutes on the drought. Last month, we talked about roughly 8% of the state, let's say between 5 and 10% of the state had come out of the drought entirely, was no longer in drought designation. And now, 1 month later, 30% of our state is no longer drought designated. It doesn't have a designation as being any type of drought. And that includes all of the Wasatch Mountains, including western central Summit County and nearly all of Wasatch County. So our counties are effectively out of the drought. Not a big surprise. And let's see. Yeah, okay. So that's actually the drought update, and I would not be surprised that by next month, 60 or 70% of the state will be out of the drought category. Now, turning towards snow melt. It's so ironic that for the last 12, 14 months, we've been talking about a drought, and now I got to start talking about the coming melt of snow. There's a great little website. It's actually the USGS, United States Geological Survey, has gauging stations on a number of creeks and streams around our area. And one of them is on McLeod Creek. McLeod Creek is that stream or creek that runs along 224 past the McPolin Barn. That's McLeod Creek. And it goes under 224 past the synagogue. So there's a gauging station right downstream from the synagogue. Basically, it monitors the water level. And I don't know if Jill, if you could bring up.
I'm trying. I just
Okay.
can't figure out how to do it.
And basically, it monitors. Well, now I got to get off because my screen is going crazy. It monitors the water levels on an almost instantaneous basis. There it is. Thank you. And this is just the water levels of McLeod Creek since April 13th through literally the past hour or so. And you can see a couple of things. Obviously, on sunny, warm days, that's when we get those nice big spikes. Our spikes, though, at this McLeod Creek location are actually occurring late in the day, starting around 5 or 6, 7, 8 p.m. at night. That's when the highest flows are being recorded on these sunny, warm days. Yesterday, at the end of the chart, we didn't have much flow because we had a cloudy, snowy day. But just bear in mind that when you start to see high flows, it's going to be near the end of the day. Conversely, the low portions of the flows are happening around 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. So there's a lag in these flow rates. But we are going to be in for it with respect to melt these next 7 days, because my 7-day forecast shows nothing but sunshine and increasingly warmer temperatures. And we're going to see this graph just increase on a daily basis, starting tomorrow. So that's the update, 11:59.
Okay, you all. Josh, thank you very much. Chris, thank
Yes,
you.
thanks, Josh.
Martha, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Time, everyone.
See you next month, last Tuesday of the month. Take care. Bye.